A nice monocot example of these tendril twiners is a genus called Smilax, and it's classified in its own family, Smilacaceae, and it gets the common name of greenbrier. These are herbaceous, very much like we saw in Dioscorea. These show us the monocot venation, parallel venation on these leaves. And what's kind of interesting, I think it's pretty interesting about this group, is their tendrils are actually produced from stipules on the leaves. So if you remember, stipules are located at the base of the leaves where it meets the stem. And we've got two of these at a time. It's a little hard to see in a lot of these images. This one kind of shows a couple of them from the base of this leaf heading out in different directions. So all these tendrils early on, as the tendrils are located nearer to the growing tip, they're going to be exploring the environment and looking for a place to latch onto. After that part of the plant has grown older, they may have detached and they kind of fade away and get stiffened into place. So they're a little harder to track at this location, but just the fact that they have this coiled shape tells us that they are indeed tendrils. Simple leaves, unlobed leaves, monocot venation. Pretty easy to identify this group if you know what to look for. Some of them are quite stiff, a little surprising, I'd say. If you're looking for a herbaceous plant, you can have some rather almost woody plants, but of course they die above ground in the winter. These plants are dioecious and they produce their flowers in umbels. I don't know if we've talked about umbels before. An umbel is an inflorescence type where all the flowers come back to a single point. So it produces this kind of globe structure. On the right is a male inflorescence, and all these flowers are coming from a very compacted location on this plant. So it's sort of a circular, globular globe shape there of the male flowers. And then here on a female plant, similar arrangement. You can't really see the pedicels on this one, but they'd all be coming from the same location. I'll go back one here to illustrate. This one's got some fruits on it, so you can also see the fruits being produced on this female plant, also in an umbel. So the arrangement of flowers tells us about the arrangement of fruits, of course. And there they are. These are berries, not berries you want to eat as far as I know. But really, the combination of features in this plant group is pretty hard to mistake it for any other group, and I quite like these. So we will talk about this big family here, Fabaceae. I mentioned before that there are some stem twiners in this group, and we're going to also put this in the category of tendril twiners. So the ones with tendrils on them go from the tips of leaves. This is pretty common. So there's a compound leaf, pinnately compound, and then toward the tip has this region where what would have been leaflets is now present as tendrils. This is a very big family worldwide. It has one of these alternative names. Oops. So Fabaceae is the sort of formulaic family name, named for the genus Faba. And then it also has this old and still used name Leguminosae. And that is basically referring to the fact that this is the legume family. We'll talk about legumes. This is the fruit type. So beans and peas and all kinds of plants, economically important and ecologically important in this group. So Leguminosae, this has a long history of association with people. This is an older name, just the leguminous, the legumish family here. So either of those names is acceptable. You'll see it sometimes as either one of these in scientific publications. Lots of features that help you to identify this group. So it's an abundant group and one you often have pretty good time or have pretty good luck identifying this family in the field. So compound leaves, very common. So trifoliolate leaves, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. This one's also 1, 2, 3. Pinnately compound, either format of being compound. And a feature on here that is sometimes easier to see is this swollen leaf base. So it's either a leaf or a leaflet, sometimes both. It's a little bit swollen. And a lot of plants in this group have the ability to move their leaves or their leaflets so they can angle towards light, angle away from danger, sometimes away from light if the light is too intense. And that structure is called a pulvinus, or plural pulvini. And it's one of those things that I'd say if you're looking for it, you can find it, but it's not so prominent it's going to necessarily jump out at you. But you can kind of see it at the bases of these leaflets. Here's one at the base of that leaflet. Nice feature of the Fabaceae family. So the fruit type here is, it's called a legume. I'll get to loment in a second here. The legume fruit type is a little bit helpful for also reminding us about the flower type. So a legume is a dry dehiscent fruit. And I always have a little bit of a problem with it. We call it dehiscent. I usually see this as described as dehiscent. I'm going to maybe just say that it's dehiscent or indehiscent. The reason I have some hesitation, if you think about your legumes you're familiar with, beans and peas, these aren't plants that typically break open as we're ready to eat them. So if you get your green beans, you're harvesting a green bean, you get the whole pod. If you let your green beans go, they might burst open. It's kind of a shape that's helpful for also reminding us how this is put together here. So this shape, this kind of teardrop shape, we've seen that in other cases. I think I diagrammed achenes for you. This is a pretty common achene shape, kind of an off-centered with a off-centered tip. This is the fruit, of course, which is left over from the ovary. And then toward the tip, the style, the stigma, sort of tapers to that location. The legume fruit type is a fruit type that results from a single carpel. So a flower with one carpel, you might call that monocarpous. Really the trick about legumes, it's not just dehiscent or indehiscent. We saw single carpal fruits that are dehiscent. We called those follicles. Single carpal fruits that are indehiscent probably wouldn't have so many seeds in them. So that's maybe a result of being associated with animal dispersers or humans. But the legume feature is to have two locations where it dehisces. So by contrast, the follicle, when it breaks open, try to draw this here, follicle splits open along one side. I said it was sort of like a coin purse. So if we had something like that, it would just break open along one side, which you often find in a legume. So if you have one of these dehiscent legumes, the black locust trees are one that comes to mind. They can kind of split open all along kind of both of those. So it sort of opens up as two flat panels. So this is kind of the textbook dehiscent version of a legume. All right, so believe it or not, I know you can find these in the black locust, but if you think of a honey locust, those stay closed up, and the animals might be trying to extract the seeds from those. So dehiscent or sometimes indehiscent. Decide for yourself. This other fruit type called loment. So if you get a big economically important family like this, I think it sometimes gets a little more attention in the vocabulary department. A loment is, I don't know why I keep drawing those. I'll just leave that one off. Loment is very much like a bean or a legume, but it's got constricted parts along it. And what it can do is it can break apart into units of one seed each. So it's kind of like a schizocarp. I think you maybe be even safe to call it a type of schizocarp. So a fruit that breaks into units. It started off as a sealed up indehiscent fruit, but each of these breaks off on its own, and each of these seeds can go off to seek its own fate, and it's still surrounded by fruit tissue. So One of the ones that I'm highlighting here, Desmodium, you might have had the experience of getting this on your clothing if you go through an environment. It's got hairs on there, and you can't really tell from this image, but those hairs have really good hooks on them. They can hold on to all kinds of clothing and animal fur. And then as they go, as they mature, this area gets weak in between the seeds, and those can go off and break apart and become their own thing. So other examples of legumes, the honey locust, Gladitia. This is one that really doesn't break open on its own. Cercis, the red bud, this one does break open on its own. So really dwelling on this dehiscent, indehiscent thing. So lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of economically important plants in the bean family. We saw the grain family, Poaceae, the grass family is widely represented in human diets. This is like the next biggest family represented in human diets. So you can see beans and other kinds of legumes, so lentils, chickpeas. These are all members of the bean family, and very important from a dietary standpoint. These are high in protein. And then one of our little more American version here. This is the peanut, native to South America, but popularized quite a bit in the United States. So soybeans, kidney beans, peas, beans, clover, so even like animal forage, alfalfa and clover, these are high in protein as forage for animals. Big important plant family. So about the protein, turns out that the protein content of legumes is due in large part to their ability to get more protein. So they have this association underground where they associate with bacteria that can fix nitrogen. And that means to pull nitrogen out of the air and turn it into useful molecules. And nitrogen is the building block for DNA. It's the building block for proteins. And it's really the protein aspect that makes a lot of sense for this group. So this plant has the ability to get a lot of nitrogen. That means it can build proteins a lot more easily. It doesn't have to get nitrogen, usable nitrogen from its environment so much as it just sort of makes it through these bacterial partnerships. And so if you've got extra nitrogen, you make extra protein, and then you will become valuable to animals who want to eat you for extra protein. I don't know if that was the desired end goal, but animals in nature and also human associated animals and humans are quite fond of all the protein we can get from bean family plants. So you can see the modifications. This is an electron micrograph. You can see the bacterial associations within the root. And then this is a side bit of the root called nodules that the plant basically makes a little home for the bacteria there. So a symbiotic partnership underground. I don't want to give this too much attention, but if we do go see any tropical plants in a greenhouse or botanical garden, you might see plants that look like this. These are also in the bean family. They don't have very typical bean family flower relative to what we have locally. I'll show you those in a second. So there are some that are just these puffball kind of inflorescences. So you can see this one shows you nicely the individual flowers, and what's really making up most of the structure is these long filaments of the stamens, and then buried in there also are some styles and stigmas, and then sometimes rather nice full circle puffball. This is a subfamily of Fabaceae called Mimosoideae, and typically more warmer climates than what we have here. The ones that you're more likely to find are in this subfamily called Faboideae. And Faboideae has, once you get to recognize them, very characteristic flowers. Maybe one of the trickier things is that they're sometimes on much different scales. So if you look at a clover, this little cluster of flowers on a clover is made up of individual bean family, very classic bean family looking flowers, but they're small and they're clustered together in this circle that you might not have looked at very carefully before. That flower looks a lot like this flower, which is a much bigger scale, looks like this one. Let me illustrate one of those for you. The bean family, so the Faboideae subfamily flower, they're made up of 5 petals, but they're kind of a variety of, let me try that differently. All right, 5 petals. There's usually this big one toward the back called the banner. And in the middle center, there's one structure called the keel. This is actually made up of 2 fused petals. And then these are called the laterals off to the side. And it's kind of an interesting arrangement where the reproductive structures are kind of tucked into this keel. So I'm drawing the carpel there. The stamens will be associated here around the kind of close to the carpel. And that can all be sealed up inside of this flower. So you get kind of like that, flower petals off to the side, and it's pretty well closed up. So it is a flower that's not particularly advertising the abundance of available pollen, not even advertising really where the ovary is or anything. It's all sealed up. And it becomes something that an animal really has to know what's inside to visit. And bees are really good at that. So this is a group that bees do pretty well to basically force their way inside, peel the laterals apart and dig into the keel and get to the reproductive structures, also including the nectar that they're more interested in. So I'd say the arrangement of petals is really distinctive, and that's probably what you would get first of all. If you're curious about the stamens also have an interesting fusion where their stamens fuse together. So either 9 together and 1 separate, or all 10 of them fused together. Don't really have the illustrations for those because they tend to be something you gotta dig in and see. And many times you're lucky to be able to identify these plants without having to dig inside of their flowers. So very diverse worldwide, also diverse in Wisconsin. Milk vetch, wild indigo, yada, 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 yada. Lots of cute plants in here, some edible ones. And then, of course, some vines. These are some highlights of the viney fabaceae you might encounter. So ground nuts and all that kind of stuff. Lathyrus, Corygira, Amphicarpea. Pretty common, like a forest understory or prairie understory kind of feature. So viney fabaceae, some herbaceous fabaceae that are not viney. I mentioned the stick-tight Desmodium, some prairie plants as well. This is a rather large prairie plant, Baptisia, Trifolium, the clover, a few varieties of that one. We have native and non-native clovers. Medicago, this one is called black medic, and it's one you often find as a weed. And then all the way up to trees. So black locust is this genus called Robinia. The honey locust is genus Gleditsia. Gymnocladis is a Kentucky coffee tree. Produces these really big pods with the gooey flesh on the inside. So very diverse, very interesting family, but one that's pretty easy to identify, I would say.